All right, let's talk about workspaces in VS Code. Now, unfortunately, workspace implementation in VS Code is kind of quirky. It it's not the most consistent implementation. Um, because of that, the documentation is also not very clear, doesn't clearly define what a workspace is and how it works. But then in this video, we'll go over what a workspace is, how it works, how to organize your repositories using workspaces, the use cases for workspaces. We're going to go over what I call an implicit and an explicit workspace, and also the hierarchical order in which configurations are applied. All right, so let's get into it. First, let me show you the quirks of workspaces in VS Code. The behavior is a little bit inconsistent, and notice that we have a button here called Open Folder. Notice that it says Open Folder, doesn't say Add Folder to Workspace. It has also the description says nothing about this being a workspace, even though it is. So let's open this folder. Let's open a repository. And notice that the repository name shows up here. And whatever files and folders we have inside this repository show up here, right? Now, if we go to the File menu, we have Add Folder to Workspace. This is implicitly telling us that this is, in fact, a workspace. Also, Save Workspace As. But down here, it says Close Folder. Now, if you close the folder, we'll go back to where we were, and we'll still have the same option, Open Folder. All right, so let's open this folder again, this repository. And if we remove folder from workspace, again implying that this is a workspace, now the button changed. In the description as well, you have not yet added a folder to the workspace, saying that this is a workspace, and it says Add Folder, presumably to the workspace instead of Open Folder. Also, if you go to the File menu, these two options are the same, but now it says Close Workspace. So I think this is weird because if VS Code assumes an implicit workspace by default, when you first open a folder, well, first of all, I think that by default, you should just have, instead of no folder opened, you should have untitled workspace here. The button should be Add Folder to Workspace. And when you add a folder to the workspace, instead of showing this, it would show whatever shows when you actually have more than one folder in your workspace. So let me add another one, and notice what happens to this bar. It changed to Untitled Workspace, right? And now the repository folders are collapsible, right? So this is what I think should happen when you open a folder for the first time in VS Code. This is what should happen. In this bar, it should say Entitled Workspace, and then the repository would be collapsible. Because otherwise, the experience is inconsistent. What's the difference between having an implicit workspace with one single folder opened and just one single folder opened in implicit workspace? It's the same thing, so it should work the same, in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I don't think I am. Okay, so this is an implicit workspace, right? And by default, VS Code just assumes that this is a workspace. That's why I call it implicit. The only problem is that the behavior is inconsistent and creates confusion, right? So when you add a folder, when you open a folder, it's still an implicit workspace, but the repository name or the folder name shows up here instead of here. It's not collapsible because it's there. So I think this should definitely be improved. All right, now let's close out this workspace, and we don't want to save it. And let's actually open an explicit workspace. And it's explicit because it is literally written in a file, a .code workspace file. And notice that opening this file opens the workspace. Well, I guess I chose this option, so it makes sense. But if you drag this file to VS Code, you will not open the file itself. You will open the workspace. So when you drag a .code workspace file into VS Code or double click it to open, VS Code will not open a file editor. It will actually read the file, interpret it as a workspace file, and open the workspace itself. Okay, now I do want to show you the file contents. So I need to open some other file and drag this to this editor group. And now you can see the file contents. All right. Now, obviously, this is an explicit workspace because everything is explicitly written here. The folders that it has, the settings, extensions, launch configurations, and tasks. Okay, so now let's go through each of these options one by one, and I will explain to you how they work and the hierarchical order in which they work. So let's go through that. So an explicit workspace has folders, and these folders are relative to where the file is. So I have this file here in the repos folder, and in parallel with this file I have the Price is Right and the YouTube auto upload. So this is their relative paths. If I had the file somewhere else, I would need to update the relative paths. Now, so a folder, the folders option is an array of objects, and they have a path key and a name key. And you can actually change this to something else. If you want to add spaces, for example, same thing here. Now notice that obviously this doesn't change the folder name itself, it just changes the folder name here, right? The folders are still called whatever they are called, right? So you can do that here, and that's pretty much it. And you can have no folders, one folder, two folders, n folders, so 0 or more. And later I'll explain to you what would be an example use case for no folders here and still have an explicit workspace. Well, I guess I can tell you now. Well, for example, if you want to do remote development and you want to connect to a remote server and you want particular settings to be applied in that session, you just open a workspace that has settings that are not the ones you have in your user settings. You just want them to be applied in that particular session that you're in which you're developing in the remote computer. So you're doing remote development, and that's a use case for having no folders, having an explicit workspace with no folders. You're just using it for the settings. Also, we can use it for extensions. All right, so let's go through settings now. So this is the hierarchical order. First, you have your default settings. These are all the defaults that VS Code comes with. These are applied first. Then you have your user settings. Whatever you have in your user settings will override your default settings. Then you have your workspace settings that will override your user settings and will be applied to all the repositories you have opened here. And finally, you have your repository settings, and those are inserted into the .vs code folder in a settings.json file, right? And right now I just have editor cursor width 6. So notice that if I'm outside outside this repository, let me just open some other file here. The cursor is thin, but if I am inside some file here, let me just open some file, doesn't really matter which, the cursor is thick, right? Because I have repository specific settings. All right. Okay, also notice that in an explicit workspace, you have settings, extensions, launch configurations, and tasks, and you also have that in the .vs code folder, and you have the extensions.json, launch.json, settings.json, and tasks.json. So these settings apply to the whole workspace. So these settings apply to both repositories, but these ones obviously just apply to this, only to this one repository. All right. Now let's get into extensions. And this is the case for these four settings, these four, I guess, configurations. So settings, extensions, launch, and tasks. Now, extensions, you have two types of things here. You have recommended extensions and unwanted recommendations. So if your whole workspace, so if all repositories in your workspace use a particular extension, you can recommend it here. And this is an array of strings, and these strings, for example, if I wanted to recommend a C# extension, I would add this here. Now, this doesn't make much sense because the C# extension is only used in this server, right? So only on this repository. So it would make more sense for me to add this recommendation only to this repository. And that's actually what I did. It's there. So if you open this this repository, you will VS Code will automatically recommend this extension to you. Then you have unwanted recommendations, and this is VS Code recommends extensions by default. And if you want VS Code to stop recommending those default extensions, you can just add them here, and VS Code will not tell you about those any longer. Then you have launch configurations and tasks, and if you want to know what these are, just go to the launch configurations video or to the tasks video, and you'll see everything about them. But as expected, you have configurations and compound configurations, which are you can combine more than one configuration into compounds, and then you should have the tasks. And that's pretty much it. And you have that for the whole workspace or just per repository. Okay. Finally, use cases for workspaces. Okay, so the most common use case is if you have a repository with a product's code and another repository with a product's documentation. It's a good idea to create an explicit workspace. So you create this file, and every time you want to work on your product, you just open the workspace and you have both repositories opened automatically. And whenever you update your product's API, for example, you update the API's documentation as well. So that would be, I guess that's the most common use case for workspaces. But there are other ones. I talked about one already before, which was you can remove all folders and you're just using the workspace for its settings. And that's useful if you're doing remote development, for example. And that's pretty much it. Now, notice that having a workspace with just a single folder in it doesn't have any advantage over having these things here, these settings here, inside the .vs Code folder. Exactly the same thing. So there's absolutely no advantage of having a .code workspace file for that, right? Doesn't make much sense. You can just add all these configurations in their own files inside the .vs Code folder. Okay, well, I guess that's it. I don't think I forgot anything. I hope this video was useful. I hope that now you have a deeper understanding of what workspaces are and why they're sometimes hard to understand, and that is because their implementation is a little bit inconsistent, and because of that the documentation isn't very clear as well. Please, if you noticed that I made any mistake on this video, or if there's something you think I could improve, please leave a comment, and I will re-record it if I agree with you, of course. All right, see you on the next one. Last thing I forgot to tell you about is how to enable certain extensions per workspace, and how to disable some extensions per workspace as well. So actually, that's not a configuration you can use on the repository settings or on the workspace settings. You do that by going to the extensions tab and then selecting one of these options, right? So for example, if you want to have an extension enabled everywhere, you just you choose this option. It's enabled everywhere for all repositories and for all workspaces. If you want to disable this extension on a particular workspace, you open that workspace and you just say disable workspace. And this extension will only be disabled in this particular workspace. If you open anything else, it will be enabled. The opposite is, of course, also true. You can disable an extension everywhere and just enable that extension for this particular workspace. Now, the thing with these options is that they are saved in VS Code's cache. They are not settings you can use on the workspace file, right? And obviously, with the consequences that has, if you change your computer, if you if you reinstall VS Code, these enabled and enabled everywhere, disabled everywhere, enabled only on this workspace, or disabled only on this workspace, these settings will not come along because they're in VS Code's cache. Okay, this was the last thing I wanted to talk about.